with some sunshine. It's still on the cold side, mind you. The signs of change here in the far southwest. And if we look at the outlook into next weekend, actually, instead of this quieter, colder weather, it gets milder, wetter and windier, really from Thursday onwards, with some showers or some longer spells of rain. And that's because we've got a big area of low pressure, several of them actually rotating around each other out in the Atlantic, drifting towards the UK, bringing more of a south to southwesterly wind, lifting the temperatures but bringing spells of rain too. Now, whilst the wind direction may change next weekend and it may not be quite as mild, we've still got low pressure sitting right over the UK, so it will stay very unsettled.
Coming up at 10:30, it's Sports Day. Then at 10:40, the papers will discuss the stories on tomorrow's front pages.
Tonight at 10, we're live in Downing Street, where Boris Johnson is celebrating the biggest Conservative victory in over 30 years. Prime Minister returned to number 10 today after seeing the Queen. He now leads a government with a majority of 80 seats in the Commons.
Thank you for the trust you have placed in us and in me, and we will work round the clock to repay your trust and to deliver on your priorities with a parliament that works for you.
His party had made sweeping gains across England and Wales, taking the Conservatives deep into Labour's former heartland areas. It was Labour's worst election performance since the 1930s, a disastrous night for Jeremy Corbyn and his team, but he's not resigning yet.
The responsible thing to do is not to walk away from the whole thing, and I won't do that. I will stay here until there has been somebody elected to succeed me, and then I will step down at that point.
In Scotland, a triumphant night for the Scottish National Party. They took almost all of the seats available, prompting new questions about the future of the Union.
Given what I fear a Tory government now has in store for Scotland, that right to choose our own future has never been more important or more urgent.
One of the SNP's casualties was Jo Swinson, who lost her seat on a bad night for her party and stepped down as leader of the Lib Dems. We'll be hearing from voters in some of the seats that produced the Conservative victory, asking what they make of the new political landscape.
Yeah, times are changing.
The Labour Party then in its day was great, but things have changed now.
Hopefully Brexit can finally get done.
Onwards and upwards, I say.
Stay with us for the story of the night, the changing political map, the future of the Brexit process, and all the day's election news.
Coming up on the BBC News channel, stay with us. We will have continuing coverage of the general election results and, of course, a first look at tomorrow morning's papers.
Good evening from a rather wet Downing Street, where Boris Johnson is back in residence tonight, this time as Prime Minister of a majority Conservative government after a notable victory in yesterday's election, where his party made sweeping gains in England and Wales. The Prime Minister said he hoped the result would bring closure to the Brexit debate and start a process of healing. Conservatives have emerged with a majority of 80 seats in the Commons, the party's biggest since 1987. But it was a very different story for Labour. It was their worst performance since the 1930s. Jeremy Corbyn says he will not lead Labour into another general election, but he hasn't yet announced his plans to step down. The Lib Dems also had a bruising night, and their leader, Jo Swinson, lost her seat to the Scottish National Party. Indeed, across Scotland, the SNP made sweeping gains, winning 48 of the 59 seats available. The electoral map of the UK was redrawn overnight. Now, with all the seats declared, This is the state of the parties. The Conservatives have 365 seats, Labour 203, the SNP 48, the Lib Dems 11, the DUP 8, Plaid Cymru 4 and the other parties 11. Now this is a map showing the geographical spread of the parties at the last election just 2 years ago in 2017, and this is how the map looks now after 47 Conservative gains, 59 Labour losses in terms of seats, 13 SNP gains and 1 loss for the Lib Dems. We'll be reporting from across the UK. We'll be hearing from voters who helped transform this political picture, and we'll be asking what the future might hold. First, our political editor Laura Kuenssberg reports on the Conservative victory. There is some flash photography coming up.
The power of surprise, the power of victory.
Well, we did it! We did it! We pulled it off, didn't we?
The power of a Prime Minister with authority firmly in his hands.
With this mandate and this majority, we will at last be able to do what? You've been paying attention.
Jubilation here, they can keep the promise to leave the EU next month. The will we, won't we, fundamental tussle of Brexit almost at an end.
This election means that getting Brexit done is now the irrefutable, irresistible, unarguable decision of the British people.
But it didn't happen just because of traditional Tories, but because of Labour voters going over. The majority he craved, the start of the change.
In winning this election, we have won votes and the trust of people who have never voted Conservative before. Those people want change. We cannot, must not let them down. And in delivering change, we must change too. Let's get Brexit done, but first, my friends, let's get breakfast done too. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you all very much. Thank you all. Thank you.
Boris Johnson has pulled off what is genuinely a historic victory, not just because it's the biggest Conservative majority since the 1980s, but also because the first time that he's reminded his party, people who'd never before considered voting for Conservative have turned to them.
I'm a northerner, so I think you have to appeal to the whole country if it gives you the mandate, which I think is what's been given tonight.
Best day, best week, and then like a Christmas present.
And by 5 o'clock, everyone said yes, and we were like, OMG, is it going to happen? And it was amazing when it did.
He's won the right to call this home for 5 years now.
Are you going to resign, Mr. Corbyn?
We love you, Jeremy Corbyn. For Jeremy Corbyn, it's the end of his ambition to move the few short miles to Westminster from his North London home.
Do you think you misread the mood?
Labour was swamped in this election. He's off by the spring, if not before.
I did everything I could. Of course, I take responsibility for putting the manifesto forward, but I have to say the manifesto was universally supported throughout our party and throughout our movement. And so, as I said in my own count result last night, we don't give up on the eternal hopes of a more decent society.
Our exit poll is suggesting that there will be a Conservative majority.
From the start, it was obvious what might be coming. One of the very first results, Blythe Valley in Northumberland, Labour since 1950 turned Tory. The new MP almost overwhelmed by the scale of that change.
And I would like to thank Boris.
And through the night, Labour's roots appeared to shrivel, whether in Yorkshire, the Midlands...
I'm just sorry that we've let people down.
...or the North East. Seat after seat flipped red to blue. Jeremy Corbyn's hopes came crashing down. And a fateful moment, just as he took to the stage in Islington. Sedgefield, the seat of Tony Blair, held by Labour for all time, broke for Boris Johnson too. The foundations of Labour victories past crumbling before our eyes. The party falling more heavily where people had voted leave.
You lost your seat, Miss Swinson.
The Lib Dems had a crushing night too. Just a few weeks ago, Jo Swinson claimed she could be Prime Minister.
523.
In the middle of the night, though, she even lost her own place in Parliament. and closed the day neither an MP nor a party leader.
All of us who share an alternative vision for society have a responsibility to learn from this result and find new answers.
They lost at the hands of the Tories and the SNP too, who cleaned up. Look at the First Minister, unable to hide her glee as news of Joe Swinson's defeat came through. Scotland yellow, England now largely blue. The Union uneasy. Another a demand for a vote on independence on the way.
Now, I acknowledge that not absolutely everyone who voted SNP yesterday is ready to support independence. Whether or not Scotland becomes an independent country must be a matter for the people who live here.
The map moved in Northern Ireland too. The DUP leader at Westminster, Nigel Dodds, lost his seat. And for the first time, more nationalists than unionists were chosen by voters, pulling at the union's thread. The Brexit Party scooped up votes, but didn't cross the bar for any seats of their own.
I do feel I thought to create what happened last night to some extent. Now look, we are going to leave the European Union now at the end of January.
Politics is a tough business.
Nor did any of those who switched allegiances in the last few torrid years. All these falling pieces created one clear picture. One man securely in charge, even though his journey gave discomfort to many voters. But with this victory, Boris Johnson has secured at least a major chapter in the kind of history books he likes to write. He won't be a footnote now. His first task to finish what they started, but with an appeal to the 48 and the 52.
To those who did not vote for us or for me, and who wanted and perhaps still want to remain in the EU. And I want you to know that we in this one nation Conservative government will never ignore your good and positive feelings of warmth and sympathy towards the other nations of Europe.
Then an unlikely claim perhaps, a post-election promise of peace and goodwill.
This country deserves a break from wrangling, a break from politics and a permanent break from talking about Brexit. Thank you all very much and happy Christmas. Thank you.
Yet this politician has been unafraid to provoke, unafraid to gamble, now swears he will govern for us all. With 5 years and a convincing majority, he has time to succeed or to stumble. For today, though, he who dared did win.
Back here in Downing Street, and Laura is with me. Let's talk short term first of all, now that he has this big majority. What's he likely to do with it?
Well, the first thing, what he promised again and again during the campaign, take us out of the European Union next month. That is absolutely the priority that was made clear during the campaign. It was the reason why Boris Johnson was chosen by the Tory party in the first place. And of course, it's what Boris Johnson campaigned for in the referendum in 2016. And ever since then, even though there was a majority to get out of the European Union at that point, the will we, won't we question is what has sort of put a load of glue onto British politics. But the majority in this election has cleared that away. Unless something very odd happens in the next 6 weeks, we will be out of the European Union by January the 31st. That doesn't mean all the long-term issues will be resolved. There'll be plenty of arguing, but that major decision for the country will actually come to pass at that point.
So if you look beyond that, beyond the short term, the immediate short term, he piled on a lot of domestic promises and pledges today beyond the Brexit issue. He's going to have to deliver now that he's made those pledges and now that he has this majority.
Clearly, and for the Prime Minister speaking here when it wasn't quite so torrential in Downing Street earlier today, absolutely, again, just as in the referendum, that controversial promise made then, he made it plain number one on the list after leaving the European Union is to sort out the very many issues in the health service. Now, clearly, what he wants to do is try to run a government that does have wide appeal right across the country, that rings true and makes sense to that political map that we saw emerge overnight. But it is a tall order. The electoral map is always moving and shifting. Last night suggests that it has suddenly changed and suddenly thrown up a different sort of equation, a different kind of Conservative party made from former Labour voters in working towns around the country together with traditional Tory shires. But we will only know maybe in 4 or 5 years' time, in the next general election, whether Boris Johnson really has been able to make that stick, to make that equation actually make sense to the country at large. This is a very significant victory for Boris Johnson, no question. But given the controversy of these times that we're living through, there's no doubt there will also be millions of people who do not feel represented by what's happened today. And of course, one thing I believe where we're going to see tensions rise is the question of the union, because this result painted most of England blue and most of Scotland yellow. And over time, that could put lots of pressure on this place.
We'll talk about that as well, Laura. Thanks very much for now. Laura Kuenssberg there, our political editor. So, we were talking there about Labour earlier. Labour suffering its worst election defeat since 1935. Not only that, it lost seats in its traditional heartlands, former Labour strongholds in the Midlands, in parts of Wales and the north of England, that had never returned Conservative MPs before. Now, our political correspondent Alex Forsyth reports from Stoke-on-Trent Central, which voted to leave the EU back in 2016 and has now gone blue for the first time in its history.
Stoke-on-Trent's industrial past is still printed on the skyline. With roots in coal, steel and, famously, ceramics, this was a Labour stronghold for decades. Not anymore. Stoke-on-Trent Central now has a Conservative MP, the first since the seat's creation in 1950. Jo Gideon, a businesswoman and until now a councillor in Kent, thinks she knows why she won here.
It's a city that feels it's been neglected and ignored for a long time, and so in a sense the fact that they voted 70% for Brexit and it didn't happen was just another example of how nobody was listening to them. And so it was a call to be listened to, really.
More people here voted to leave than any other city in the UK. The Tories tapped into Brexit frustration in Labour's heartlands. John is a former miner.
I've always voted Labour all my life, I've been till this time.
And who did you vote for?
Conservative.
Why is that?
To get something done on this Brexit business.
So you switched from Labour to Conservative?
Yes. I don't like Jeremy Corbyn for one. He was trying to put the country back years.
Some in Labour claim their policy offer was crowded out by Brexit, which was the Tories' relentless focus.
The Conservatives deliberately put Brexit front and centre of their campaign, hoping it would transcend traditional party loyalties, and so targeting areas that voted to leave in the Midlands and the North. And that's where they gained support.
While Labour wrestles with the reasons behind this result, the former MP here called it a catastrophe, last night laying blame on the party's leaders.
In Stoke-on-Trent, we're going to have another 5 years of Tory government, probably with 3 Conservative MPs, and the damage and the untold horrors they will unleash in Stoke-on-Trent, I believe, lays firmly at the door of those running the National Party's campaign and the decisions that they have made about where to target and the sort of Brexit response they should have made.
In this city, some loyal to Labour are surprised at the extent of their losses.
I'll never be a Tory voter. I was born in 1985, my mum was a single mother, we were at the tail end of kind of the Thatcher decade and we were really struggling. And to see such a working class and hard working and friendly city like Stoke-on-Trent be turned, it's just so sad to see.
The country's political map does look very different today, with some who've never voted Tory now making that choice.
We've got to go with Boris, I'm afraid. So, yeah, times are changing.
They most certainly are. Alex Forsyth, BBC News, Stoke-on-Trent.
Well, Jeremy Corbyn insisted he was proud of his party's manifesto and defended his record as party leader. Mr Corbyn, who was elected Labour leader back in 2015, announced he would stand down after what he called a period of reflection, although some of his MPs have called on him to resign immediately. Our deputy political editor, John Pienaar, looks now at Labour's future and a warning, there are some flashing images coming up again.
Here comes the leader, and there goes the leader. After last night, the media was keen to catch Jeremy Corbyn's thoughts in defeat. One cameraman who took a nasty tumble especially.
We're going to say sorry. What about all the MPs who've lost their seats?
A lot keener anyway than he was to talk to them. It was a car crash, Labour's election, and this trip didn't go too well either. Now Mr Corbyn's not rushing the next leader's election.
What I hope is there will be a period when we can have a good discussion within the party, and I think that's healthy and that's to be very welcome. And I hope those that were inspired by our manifesto will actually join the party and take part in that discussion. And it's up to them to set a programme for when an election will take place. It'll be in the early part of next year.
Jeremy Corbyn didn't put it like this, but he failed badly. And now he and his team are looking for someone they'd like to carry on what they've always described as the socialist struggle. There's no clear sign who that person might be, so they want time to plan and prepare for the succession. Labour's hurt won't heal quickly. Remainers and Leavers blaming each other or the leader for pleasing no one. Centrists raged at devoted Corbyn followers for turning off traditional supporters.
Corbyn was a disaster on the doorstep. Everyone knew that he couldn't lead the working class out of a paper bag. Now John's developed this momentum group, this party within a party. I want him out of the party. I want momentum gone. Go back to your student politics.
Momentum has, captured the energy and enthusiasm of the hundreds of thousands of people who've joined the Labour Party in support of precisely these policies.
The party's splitting ahead of a New Year leadership contest. Those who embraced politics the Corbyn way and blamed Brexit for defeat, and those who say Labour and its leader got it wrong.
So many people said to me on the doorstep, Phil, if you had a different leader, I'd vote for you. You'd walk it. There wouldn't be a problem. You'd probably form the next government. So they thought that, and the one thing that was holding them back from voting Labour was the current leadership of the Labour Party.
Unfortunately, our Labour heartlands, working class heartlands in the North and the Midlands that voted Leave, they undoubtedly felt that Labour had let them down.
So who could join the race to lead Labour? There's Rebecca Long-Bailey, but does she want the job? Angela Rayner's been mentioned, perhaps as deputy leader though. Keir Starmer's a centre-ground pro-European, which could put some off. Emily Thornberry's a strong performer and looks ambitious. Then Lisa Nandy's young, left-leaning, looks like another contender. And Jess Phillips, outspoken, combative, maybe the wild card of the contest. Jeremy Corbyn's heading for a quieter life. To his admirers, an heroic loser. To critics, the man who consigned Labour to a fourth term out of office. They'll all be fighting over Labour's future before Jeremy Corbyn's even out of sight. John Pienaar, BBC News.
Well, as the Scottish National Party swept to victory across Scotland, taking 48 out of the 59 seats, the future of the Union is again in sharp focus, with Nicola Sturgeon asserting that Boris Johnson has no right to stand in the way of another referendum on Scottish independence. Our Scotland editor Sarah Smith looks at what the SNP's victory means for Scotland and indeed for the United Kingdom.
Posing with some school kids this morning, Nicola Sturgeon has one clear demand: that their political future be decided by Scottish voters. She believes that winning 80% of the seats in Scotland means she must now be allowed to hold another independence referendum. But legally, she needs Boris Johnson to agree.
So to the Prime Minister, let me be very clear. This is not simply a demand that I or the SNP are making. It is the right of the people of Scotland. And you, as the leader of a defeated party in Scotland, have no right to stand in the way.
The prospect of another independence referendum is not imminent. Boris Johnson will refuse permission. But that will put his government on a constitutional collision course with the party that dominates Scotland. And that risks further increasing support for Scottish independence. The Conservative campaign focused almost entirely on rejecting another referendum. But it's the Tories who were rejected in over half of their Scottish seats.
The people who gave us that vote, who voted for us last night, did so on the basis that we would stand up for Scotland's place in the United Kingdom. And I'm simply not prepared to betray the votes of those people for us last night.
The Lib Dem leader Jo Swinson was defeated by the SNP landslide. But Scottish Labour suffered the greatest humiliation. They were even beaten by a candidate who'd been suspended from the SNP and have only one surviving Scottish MP.
I'm sick at standing in lecterns during general election campaigns and saying it's been a difficult night for the Labour Party. This party must listen, and this party must respond, or this party will die.
The entire city of Glasgow is now represented by the SNP and ready for another referendum.
I definitely think we should be allowed to have an independence referendum, and I think that steps should be taken, if possible, to force them to make us have one, to let us have one.
I just think that it's getting like England's going one way, Scotland's going another, so we should be able to decide for ourselves.
If the will's there and obviously they get the go-ahead for Westminster, then it will happen again, and obviously we'll then have to make that choice again, and I'll be voting no again.
Boris Johnson has to go, hey, hey. Hundreds of demonstrators marched through Glasgow city centre tonight, protesting against the Tory government they say Scotland did not vote for. As this country moves in a different political direction, it will inevitably test the endurance of the whole United Kingdom. Boris Johnson has spoken on the phone with Nicola Sturgeon tonight, and we're told that he made clear his resolute opposition to another independence referendum. But she told him she doesn't believe it's credible for him to try and deny Scotland its right to choose its own future.
Sarah, many thanks again. Sarah Smith there, our Scotland editor, with the latest on the Analsyst there in Scotland. Now, it was a terrible night for the Liberal Democrats, who now have just 11 members of Parliament. Jo Swinson was elected leader just in July this year, but last night lost her own seat in Dunbartonshire East. Our chief political correspondent, Vicky Young, assesses the future of the Lib Dems as an electoral force.
Her leadership over, it didn't even last 5 months. Jo Swinson's decision to push for this election backfired. Some blame her for hardening the party's anti-Brexit message and for claiming she could be Prime Minister, which few took seriously.
I'm proud that Liberal Democrats have been the unapologetic voice of Remain in this election, giving people the chance to choose to stop Brexit. Obviously, it hasn't worked. And I, like you, am devastated about that. But I don't regret trying.
And she spoke about the personal criticism that's come her way.
Being myself, whether people attacked my vision or my voice, my ideas or my earrings. One of the realities of smashing glass ceilings is that a lot of broken glass comes down on your head.
Once again, party workers left distraught after a dismal general election performance. Many blame a shift in policy in September when the Lib Dems said they'd cancel Brexit if they won the election. It was distinctive, but undemocratic, according to some.
I think we've, in a way, become more extreme, and we came across as a party with an extreme position on Brexit, and we gave people a positive reason to vote against us, including many traditional supporters.
For most Lib Dem candidates today, there were messages of commiseration, not congratulation.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
In Wimbledon, Paul Kohler narrowly lost out. He thinks it's time for Labour and the Lib Dems to work together.
We need to learn some lessons. We have to give credit to our opponents, but learn the lesson. They combined, the Brexit Party and the Conservatives formed an alliance. That's why we lost. Progressive Liberals didn't. We formed an alliance with the Greens, but Progressive Liberals in the Labour Party weren't on board.
There were some huge increases in the Lib Dem vote. Almost 4 million backed them this time. But in many places, it wasn't enough.
Wimbledon was a typical Liberal Democrat target seat, held by the Conservatives, an area that voted heavily to remain in the EU. The party ran an energetic local campaign, but so did Labour. The Remain vote was split and the Conservative re-elected, with a majority of just over 600.
This election was a huge opportunity for the Lib Dems, but their dreams of stopping Brexit have fallen by the wayside. Vicky Young, BBC News, Wimbledon.
Well, by targeting Labour constituencies, which voted to leave in the 2016 EU referendum, the Conservatives advanced into areas that had previously been out of their range. And that was the prime factor, really, in achieving a substantial Commons majority which should now see the Brexit process speeding up, as Laura was telling us earlier. Our correspondent John Kay has been to visit 3 of those former Labour seats, and he starts his journey in Blythe Valley in the northeast of England, one of the first seats to declare last night, turning blue for the first time in its history, symbolising all the change of this election.
Ian Levy, the Conservative Party candidate, 17,000.
Would you believe it? Blythe Valley in Northumberland woke up with a Conservative MP for the first time ever.
So how are you feeling this morning?
Good. Walking her dog by the North Sea, we meet Alison, Labour born and bred, but this time Tory.
And I know a lot of people are saying, oh, well, I was brought up Labour, my dad voted Labour, my mum. Those days are long gone. The Labour Party then, in its day, was great, but things have changed now.
But what has changed? What's different this time?
I think it's all around Brexit, yeah. People have voted to leave, but Jeremy Corbyn wanted to hold another referendum.
Until last night, Blythe was a brick in Labour's red wall, a block of supposedly safe seats stretching for miles across the country, but not anymore. We head under the Tyne to Sedgefield. This was Tony Blair's house when he was the local MP. In the days of New Labour, he had a majority of 20,000 here. Now, all change.
This constituency went Conservative.
Never.
Yeah.
I don't believe it.
We meet care worker Andrea at the end of her night shift. She stuck with Labour and thought others would in this old mining community.
How big a shift is this, that Sedgefield is now Conservative?
It's unbelievable. It isn't. It's just totally 100% mad. It's the biggest change I've ever seen in my life.
Are you going to change the colour of your car?
No.
But Derek has changed the way he votes. A retired pit worker, he's been Labour for 70 years.
How did you feel voting Conservative for the first time?
I didn't feel anything. I thought it was the right thing to do, and that's why I did it.
And do you now consider yourself to be a Conservative?
No, no, I don't. I voted against Jeremy Corbyn. That's what I voted against.
It was a vote against Labour, not necessarily for Conservatives.
No.
We heard that a lot today as we headed west through newly blue Bishop Auckland. Former Labour voters saying they just hadn't trusted Jeremy Corbyn on Brexit, security or the economy. Our final stop, Cumbria,
bringing together the whole of this incredible United Kingdom,
where Workington Man was supposed to be the typical voter the parties needed to woo. The Conservatives won here as well. So what now? How much do you trust Boris Johnson to deliver what you voted for?
Boris himself, I don't know. But the party in general, I'd like to think there's some trust.
Trust's a big thing in politics, isn't it? Because there's many amount of them that tell a lot of lies, but fingers crossed.
From the North Sea to the Irish Sea, Labour's red wall reduced to rubble. John Kay, BBC News.
Well, the Conservatives did lose votes in the south of England and Scotland, but these were balanced by all the gains in the rest of England and Wales. Labour, meanwhile, lost vote share in every nation and region across Britain. Now, my colleague Reeta Chakrabarti has been looking at some of the key results in more detail.
I want to show you the final scoreboard, the state of the UK parties. And as you can see, the Conservatives having a very good night, gaining 47 seats. Labour losing 59 seats, a bad night for them. And the SNP also putting in a strong performance, gaining 13 seats. I want to show you, though, how the vote share changed compared to the 2017 election. And what's so interesting here is that the Conservatives actually only put on 1 point in terms of vote share. The Labour vote share dropped sharply by 8 points, and it's the difference between the two that's allowed the Conservatives to surge forward and gain all those seats. I want to show you some more detail about Conservative gains from Labour. And here are some really old traditional Labour strongholds that have just tumbled to the Conservatives. Seats like Sedgefield, Tony Blair's old seat, a seat where he once had a 25,000 majority, that's now gone Conservative. Great Grimsby, Labour since the war, now Conservative. And Bassett Law in Nottinghamshire, now a Conservative seat. Let me show you what happened to the Labour vote, down by 25 points. Labour vote completely collapsing in Bassett Law, and that represents a swing from Labour to Conservative of 18%. That's the biggest swing of the night that we saw. I want to show you one more thing, which is the different way in which the country voted, depending on whether people were in strongly Leave seats or strongly Remain seats. As you can see, the Conservatives doing well in those Leave seats, Labour's vote dropping sharply, but both the main parties losing share of the vote in the strongly Remain seats. But again, it's the difference between the two performances that's important here. The Conservatives performed less badly than Labour and therefore were able to pick up seats. Well, you can find much more detail on all of this, including your own results in your own constituency, all on the BBC News website.
That was Reeta there with a look at some of the figures in more detail. Well, as we heard earlier, in Northern Ireland, there's been political change too. Nationalist MPs, whose political goal is a united Ireland, now outnumber Unionist MPs for the first time. And the big result of the night for many was the defeat of Nigel Dodds, the Democratic Unionist leader at Westminster. But both the DUP and Sinn Féin saw their votes significantly reduced after 3 years of failure to restore the power sharing at the Northern Ireland Assembly. Emma Vardy's report on the result in Northern Ireland does contain some flashing images.
A major player leaving the stage. Nigel Dodds, so influential for the DUP at Westminster and in the campaign to leave the EU, leverage over the Brexit process at an end for the party and for him.
I am absolutely very disappointed, not just for North Belfast, but actually for Northern Ireland, that they're losing such a great advocate in Nigel Dodds.
John Finucane's win, highly symbolic for Republicans, the son of a solicitor murdered by loyalists during the Troubles.
This is a watershed moment for Northern Ireland. North Belfast now with a Nationalist MP for the first time, ousting a veteran politician in a night of bitter blows for the Democratic Unionists.
I do want to acknowledge the fact that everybody who voted for me tonight aren't necessarily Sinn Féin supporters. They do have issues with some of our policies. They stretch themselves on this, but they did so because of the nature of the threat that Brexit is. It is a threat that transcended party politics.
And in a place marked by division, a remarkable win for the centre ground. The Cross-Community Alliance Party taking only its second ever Westminster seat. And a return to Westminster for the SDLP. Moderate nationalists who want to see a united Ireland, attracting voters in Londonderry away from the more uncompromising Sinn Féin, who don't take their seats in Parliament.
You want someone to go to Westminster to fight your case, to stand up to Boris Johnson, to protect us from Brexit, but you also want us to get back to work in Stormont.
But none of the Northern Ireland parties back Boris Johnson's Brexit deal. And big differences must be overcome for a devolved government to return to Stormont. Well, after 3 years of paralysis here since power sharing collapsed, voters have signalled their frustration. Votes for the DUP and Sinn Féin were down across the board. And already tonight, the Irish Prime Minister, Taoiseach Leo Varadkar, has spoken to Boris Johnson, promising to help get this place back on its feet again. So yes, fresh impetus, new talks due to start next week, but still it won't be easy.
Emma, many thanks again. Emma Vardy there with the latest at Stormont in Northern Ireland. Well, Labour's heartlands in Wales were not safe from the Conservative sweep, where they gained 6 seats. The Tories took seats including Wrexham, which had been Labour since 1935, and they took the rural seat of Brecon and Radnorshire from the Lib Dems too. Now, our correspondent Howell Griffith starts his report in Wrexham in North East Wales.
Only £2 a bunch.
Welcome to a town of first-time Tories. Wrexham has never returned a Conservative MP before. For most of a century it's stuck with Labour through thick and thin. Austerity bit hard here, but it's turned its back on the party and gone from red to blue. For Liam, it was all about delivering Brexit.
get it done. We should be an independent country. We should be moving forward, looking at different things. Onwards and upwards, I say.
Others lacked faith in Labour's leader. For Pam, he was the reason she voted Tory.
I really just didn't want Jeremy Corbyn to be our Prime Minister. I don't think there was a great deal to choose from, but I just didn't want him in as the Prime Minister.
You'd rather Boris Johnson?
Well, kind of, yeah.
Wrexham is at the western edge of the so-called Red Wall, Labour seats targeted by the Tories. Irene Lewis was, until a few months ago, vice chair of the local Labour Party. But this time she lent her vote to Boris Johnson, and she'd consider doing it again.
If the policies of the Conservatives are more in line with my thinking, then I will vote for them.
It may not be a one-off.
It may not be a one-off, no.
This wasn't a Tory takeover. Labour remains the largest party in Wales, but it's been humbled, losing votes on Brexit, not connecting through its leader, and vitally, failing to persuade voters here on its record after 20 years of running public services in Wales. There was little festive cheer for the other parties either. The Lib Dems lost their only Welsh seat, Plaid Cymru held their 4. But it will be the Conservatives who feel that Christmas has come early. Hywel Griffith, BBC News, Wrexham.
So now that the Conservatives have a very solid majority of 80 seats in the Commons, what does that mean for the Brexit process? Before Christmas, Parliament will almost certainly pass Boris Johnson's withdrawal agreement bill. That's the law that provides the framework for leaving the EU on January 31st next year. And the UK will then be in what's known as a transition or an implementation period. And trade talks to decide our long-term relationship with the EU would then begin. But if there's no agreement reached, the UK could still leave the EU without a deal at the end of December 2020. So with all of that said, let's talk to our economics editor, Faisal Islam, who's with me. How does this change the Brexit process, this election result?
So what's absolutely clear is that legally we will be leaving the European Union at the end of January. The Chancellor can mint that 50p commemorative coin without fear of it being melted down. We saw a market reaction, we saw sterling going up, we saw stocks, various stocks going up pretty high, reflecting a little bit of the uncertainty of a Labour government, enforced nationalisations, that going away, but also a little bit of certainty over that timetable. But what happens after January the 31st, that is more uncertain. There is a fundamental decision for this Prime Minister to make about just how close the UK will remain economically to Europe after Brexit, and that's the fundamental thing of the negotiation. When he visited all these red wall seats that we've been talking about today, he did make some promises. He promises to protect the supply chains of the manufacturing industry. Well, those industries say you can't reconcile that with leaving without a trade deal. Into this comes the President of the United States, who was making an offer essentially via Twitter in his congratulations to the Prime Minister, saying that a deal with the US would be more lucrative than any deal with the EU. A choice, a trade-off that will affect sectors, regions and voters, and a choice in the hands of the Prime Minister.
Faisal, once again, thanks very much. Faisal Islam there, our economics editor. Well, last night we saw the kind of political change across much of the UK that, well, a decade ago would have seemed unthinkable. The starkest examples of that change, as we've mentioned already, are the seats represented for generations by Labour, but now in Conservative hands. Our special correspondent Ed Thomas has been in West Bromwich West in the West Midlands to take a look at the new political landscape there.
Look beyond the cities and move to the towns of the north of England, the Midlands, to make sense of this election. To the people in constituencies like West Bromwich West.
You shall be this way from home.
And listen.
Congratulations, Boris Johnson.
To the voices of Kuenssberg.
It's happiness, it's absolutely amazing.
Does it feel like you've woken up in a different country?
Yeah, I do. It's going to sort out everything, you know? The poor, NHS, schools, police, immigration.
What was the thing that got you voting for him? The one thing?
Because he wanted to listen to 17.4 million people.
For the first time in 45 years, this constituency has broken its bonds with Labour.
Family, generation after generation for the working class.
Labour voter, Labour voter, Labour voter.
Definitely.
And now that's all changed.
Yeah.
And you've woken up to a Conservative MP, West Brom West.
Yes.
How does that feel?
That feels okay, actually.
I think it's great, it's what the country needs.
A Conservative MP in this area?
No, because Jeremy Corbyn's a puppet.
That's the end of it.
And that was the issue for you?
Yeah, every time.
It's about time London listened to the rest of the country.
They're listening now.
They are now, at last.
And for many, this demand to be heard has been a 3-year journey. Here, nearly 7 out of 10 who voted in the 2016 referendum wanted to leave the EU. Take Philip, a welder since he left school.
Yeah, how do you feel today? Happy. Hopefully Brexit can finally get done.
He feels this election result is a turning point.
I believe that Boris Johnson is going to sort it out, and by the 31st of January we'll be leaving the EU.
We've turned a corner. We have more certainty, hopefully moving forward, more certainty in the marketplace. I just think it's a good thing for the UK.
Now a new contract has been made. Trust given to Boris Johnson's Conservative Party.
Hello.
For the first time by people like Lou and Joe.
What are you wearing, so?
2 working mums struggling.
How difficult is life at the moment for you two?
For me, personally, very difficult. I'm coming down here just to think about what I've got to do today, how I'm going to get through, what my finances are like, how I'm going to get through the day, what bills I'm going to pay.
Despite a Conservative Prime Minister for 9 years, they believe Boris Johnson is different.
What is the hope you see in Boris Johnson? And what do you expect of him?
You know what? He talks the talk and walks the walk.
Brexit's going to happen next year. On all the trade deals, he's promised to do it.
Because you've been told this will be done.
That's what Boris has told us, and I want him to. He's made a promise. Stick to your promise. We're fed up of being failed by the governments.
Is your vote on loan to Boris Johnson?
Yeah. Until he delivers.
Old party allegiances have broken down. New loyalties have been born. But for how long? Maybe that depends on promises made and promises kept. Ed Thomas, BBC News, West Bromwich.
So that's it from Downing Street, where the skies have opened tonight. This is where Boris Johnson is tonight celebrating a momentous election victory with an 80-seat majority for the Conservatives in the new House of Commons. The Prime Minister says he wants to get on with delivering Brexit, but he also pledged a big drive on domestic issues, focusing on the NHS and the clear need for greater investment to improve standards of care. Mr Johnson has, I think it's fair to say, raised the voters' expectations, and with a strong majority in Parliament, he will now be expected to deliver on all the promises that he's made. We'll leave you tonight with some of the memorable words and images of the general election, which has changed the electoral map of the UK. Have a good night. Our exit poll is suggesting that there will be a Conservative majority.
Getting Brexit done is now the irrefutable, irresistible, unarguable decision of the British people.
I will not lead the party in any future general election campaign.
Corbyn was a disaster on the doorstep. Everyone knew that he couldn't lead the working class out of a paper bag.
For me, this is about whether the Labour Party even has any right to exist.
I still believe that we, as a country, can be warm and generous.
Scottish National Party, 17,000.
Afternoon, everybody. I say thank you for the trust you have placed in us and in me. I urge everyone to find closure and to let the healing begin. And happy Christmas.